Welcome to Classic 4x4, the podcast for and by classic four-wheel drive enthusiasts, restorers, and collectors. I'm your host, Chris Bocconi, and you can follow the podcast on Instagram at Classic4x4 Podcast, and you can follow my trials, tribulations, and antics of collecting and restoring classic four-wheel drives also on Instagram at Overland by the Sea. Today's guest is interesting on a million different levels. Not only does he have experience in a very rare diesel engine, also a very rare Jeep model, but he has a pretty cool name, right? I feel like he should be a more of like an actor, and we should be introducing the new feature with this amazing actor by the name of Dakota Black. So let me introduce Dakota Black. Dakota, thanks for joining us today.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So for those of you out there that don't follow Dakota, you got to on Instagram. His Instagram handle is the SD33 Garage, and that gave away what we're about to talk about today. So not only does Dakota have an immense amount of knowledge on, a very rare and unique foreign diesel engine, which is the Nissan SDs. There were the SD 20s, 22s, 23s, 25s. But what most people know is the SD33s, but also has an immense knowledge base and owns two CJ-10s. And for all of our listeners out there, that is one of the CJs that is on my conquest list that I have not owned yet. And I'm jealous that Dakota owns two. So let's start off here, Dakota. Tell us about yourself, how you got into not only classic four-wheel drives, but into SD33 Nissan diesel engines and CJ-10s.
Awesome. Well, for starters, grew up on a family farm out in the county, and we always had like diesel tractors, diesel trucks, of course, 4x4 trucks. We always had like 70s Fords around. My mom actually has a 74 Scout of her own. And that was just something we grew up around. So it was kind of a natural progression just at home to be into the classic 4x4s and the engines and all that. And then on top of that, having a family business working on automotive. I mean, I was constantly around rigs, just of all shapes and size, especially my dad being really interested in really oddball stuff. At one point, he had like this Nissan UD truck that had been shortened, and that was my dad's tow pig. So like, I can remember sitting in a car seat in this big bubble cab over, hauling who knows what all over the place. And it was just a blast. And I think that's the kind of stuff that really got me into diesel specific, but along those lines, like putting that stuff to work, which connects to the working class trucks, like his whole theory of working rigs, and that was something I was always around.
That's cool. So how did you end up getting super into like the Nissan SD33s? Because I'm gonna drop your collection right now, which I usually have my guest introduce the collection, but I want to drop it because I want to talk about it, right? Because that'll bring us into the SD33s, which is. So you have two CJ-10As, an 82 and an 86, correct?
Yep.
And those are factory with SD33s.
Exactly. Yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah, because I believe only the CJ-10A, they all had SD33s, whereas it was the CJ-10 exports where you could get the 2.5, the 4.2, and the SD33.
Exactly. Yeah.
Cool. And then you have two other, which I would love to talk about in length, but this is the Classic 4x4 podcast. You have two other super cool cars in your collection, which is a 74 Dodge Dart and a 74 Plymouth Duster. But correct me if I'm wrong, those also have diesel SD33s.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah.
And where do you find those? Is my real question.
Well, I mean, I'm sure you can relate. Like, if you're after something, you're looking every day. I mean, I get sucked in the scroll. I mean, you're just like, okay, we're finding it. We're finding it. Boom. Here we go. I mean, if you look every day, you might find something. So
That's true. I'm the same way. Everybody knows my morning routine where I get up, I'm looking at the marketplaces, I'm looking at the market, that's my thing. So
yeah.
Why SD33s? So before we get into what they are and when we talk about, especially on the podcast and in the truck community in general, when everybody talks about diesel engines, 90% of the time it's talking purely about, the Cummins. What Cummins is it, right? And then the other 10%, I'd say of that, if I was to break that other 10% down, 7% of that is talking about the Power Strokes, and the remaining 3% is about the Duramaxes, right? Yep. Nobody's talking about Nissan SD33 diesel engines. So how'd you get into it, man?
Well, it's actually a pretty cool story, especially having the shop. Again, we were kind of around those weird rigs all the time, and had a family friend / customer talked to my dad about working on this 74 Dart that had a factory diesel. I shouldn't say factory, dealer option diesel. But anyways, the guy ended up not really doing anything with it. And when I was like 14, my dad took me along to go check out this Dart. And the funny story is that he was only looking at the Dart because he wanted to have the engine for my white CJ-10A. Because we had purchased that way back when. So I went along, and the story goes that it was purchased as a mail car. And it ended up in his hands in kind of a roundabout way. And he was super local to us. So it was like a 2-minute drive to go check this thing out. And we put a battery in it and drove it home. And I'd already developed a love for diesel at that point. So my dad couldn't separate it. So we bought it for $500. And when I got my license, it was mine. That was when I drove all through high school, all through tech school. I got crazy stories from it. And it being a 4-door, we just packed all my buddies in it and drove all over the place. I mean, so that's gone up the mountain. It's gone through the snow, everything. So
that is why everybody knows that one of my common questions is what was your first car? And I think you win the prize for the most amazing first car, a diesel 74 Dodge Dart powered by a Nissan SD33 diesel engine. So I think you win. I think unless in the future in coming seasons we get somebody that has something more off the wall, you are the winner right now for season 1 and season 2 of the Classic 4x4 podcast. So that's awesome. So we all know about the SD33 engines because it's what's in every Nissan Patrol. It's anytime you see a Patrol out there, that's what is in it, right? But a lot of people don't know that International Harvester, that was the diesel option for the Scouts from 76, mid 70s, all the way through the late 70s and even into 80. I think the turbo was available in 80, 81 before Harvester stopped producing vehicles. But most importantly, not only was it an option on the CJ-10, which were all exported out of this country, but it was standard on the CJ-10A, which was essentially just the same thing as the CJ-10, just shorter wheelbase, and it was under a government. They were produced for a government contract. So what makes the SD33 not only desirable, but also very unique?
For desirable, they're ridiculously reliable. I mean, just I mean, for example, I didn't have to do anything other than regular maintenance to my stuff all the time, all the years I've had it. I mean, you can have like hoses go, but you're not going to be doing injectors. You're not going to be doing injection pumps. You're not going to be having to swap out liners and all that. But yeah, very reliable and fairly compact. So like you can put it in a lot of different rigs and they're relatively light. I mean, they didn't do any modifications to the front suspension on the Dart that I have. They just plopped that sucker in there, and here we are all these years later. But so yeah, they're really light, easy to apply to multiple different applications, and just very reliable, super fuel efficient. My Dart gets like 30 miles to the gallon, like rain or shine, no matter what. And it's so easy to work on. I think that's a big piece.
What about parts? What about parts? Are parts easy to come by?
You know, it's kind of hit or miss because like you can go to a lot of different websites right now and find parts for them. I want to say it's international. If you look up International Scout Diesel for parts, it'll list all the standard Scout guys websites, and you can find parts on theirs, like whether it's new old stock, if it's used stuff, or even some new. Although you can find most of it. There are some weird stuff that you kind of have to dig for. Injection pumps are a little harder to find. And injectors, stuff like that. But typically you can find everything you need. Myself, I was in the process of I was going to rebuild one of the engines I had. And we have this connection with the marine business just down the street, and called him up, and he's like, "Oh yeah, I can get you a rebuild kit. No problem." And he had it to me in like a week.
On a discontinued Japanese diesel engine. He just got you a rebuild kit.
Oh yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's amazing. Because I knew there were a lot of, just I guess this is true with any diesel engine. There's also commercial applications, which is
totally
why these things ended up in the CJ-10s in the first place. So
exactly.
That's pretty cool. And the SD33s are a 3.2 liter. They're the straight six, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And that's
there's a lot of. Oh, go ahead.
That's what differentiates it from the SD20 series. Is that the SD20 series were, correct me if I'm wrong, and I'm the one telling the expert for some reason. I don't know why, but I did a real deep dive before this interview. But the 20 series are a straight 4, I believe, correct?
Yeah, yeah. And it's kind of cool because it even goes even further than that. I mean, there's like 3 different versions of the 4-cylinder. There's also even a 3-cylinder that nobody really talks about, but it's there, and it's called like the SD16. And you can find those in like tractors and old school like irrigation pumps, and you can continue on. It's crazy. You can find them in really weird applications all over the place.
That's pretty cool. That's super neat. So, obviously you're in the Nissan SD33 community. You have 4 vehicles that have them from the factory or were dealer installed, when they were still on before, when they were new, I should say. But what have you seen people swap the SD33s into? Anything wild?
Oh, that's a good question. It's kind of a niche group.
Yeah.
Because they are gutless. I mean, you wouldn't want to put it in anything very big. I've seen some pretty cool old school swaps back when there wasn't really the 12 valves yet. For example, if you go on like barnfinds.com and you look at, there's a Ford F-150 or it might have even been an F100, like a 76. Some guy swapped the Nissan diesel in with a 727 torque flight into a Ford, which is just wild. But he did it as like a proof of concept back when the oil crisis hit. Like, they were really trying to, all these people are trying to find solutions to help like produce something that would be more fuel efficient and less or more reliable. So that being said, there's a lot of weird swaps out there that were done like during the 70s that you can find. Like, there was another guy who took a old like Fargo pickup and swapped the Nissan diesel into it. So every now and then you can find really weird swaps, and myself always looking, like every now and then I've come across one and I'm like, oh, and I go to try and buy it and it's gone so fast. But
now do you
I haven't
have
seen anything super weird yet, honestly. It's usually like period correct. So anything 70s to 80s, I've seen some swaps done. But it's not a super common swap just because they are so gutless.
That's neat. Now, do you have a couple laying around the shop that, because you do have 4 vehicles in your collection that have SD33s in them, and eventually, I mean, they're machines. It's not if, it's just when, right? We all know that, right? And of course, we all know that there is one rule, that is the when happens at the absolute worst time, right? So do you just have a couple SD33s hanging around the shop?
I've got like more than a couple. I think total I have 10. I have 10 of them. And I started picking them up whenever I could. Like, as soon as like literally the day after I graduated high school, my buddy and I drove down to Oregon, which it was like a 7-8 hour drive for us. And I picked up 2 from a Scout collector. And he had 2 just laying around. But when I got there, like, one of them's half in the ground. Like, literally we had to pick it up with a tractor out of the ground, and the other one was sitting on a stand. So anytime I can, I try and pick these up, because you just never know if you're going to run into that scenario where you need that one part that you're not going to be able to find otherwise. And for myself, like, enjoying the engines, there's a lot of guys that scrapped these motors way back when. I mean, it starts to use a little bit of oil, and they're just like, well, time to go. Let's put something with real horsepower in it. And they take it to the scrapyard and it gets crushed. So anytime I can find it within 2 states, I'm gonna go get it. Just last year, of course, my girlfriend wants to go all over the place and get to go on these fun vacations. And me, like, being really stuff on the idea of trying to be working all the time. Finally, I tell her, hey, let's go on a trip. And she's like, oh, where to? And I'm like, let's go to Montana. And she's all excited. And I'm like, there's a motor there.
So she's probably hoping that there's like SD33s in Aruba, the British Virgin Islands.
Yeah, there you go.
Somewhere in the Caribbean.
It's funny you say that. So she finally got me to go to Hawaii, which no problem going again. That was a blast. But literally, we're getting ready to go. And I switched my marketplace to Hawaii. I'm like, please, Lord, be a cool Nissan Diesel Scout or something that I can go look at. And sure enough, there was a Terra, like, immaculate. And I was so excited. I was like, oh, I'm going to hit this guy up. Maybe he can, like, give it a showing, and like I could check it out. And he did not get back to me.
No. That's funny, man. That's pretty cool. So that is interesting. And we got a little history on the SD33s. And I'm sure a lot of our listeners didn't know that, that was the diesel option for Scouts, and they were pretty much the standard, though there were other options. They were the standard powertrain in the CJ-10s and in every single CJ-10A. And we should actually mention, we could talk about the shop. Your family business is a full service repair and maintenance shop called Unlimited Service out of Bellingham, Washington. And I know you guys have a couple locations. And believe it or not, I was actually looking at some analytics recently for the podcast, and a majority. So if you rank the metro areas where all of our listeners come from, actually, the Seattle metro area ranks number one. So we have most of our Classic 4x4 podcast listeners actually come out of the Seattle metro area. So I'm sure we have some people out there that hopefully will stop by the shop and want to check out those 10 extra engines, swap them into something fun, and get some work done on their vehicle at a limited service in Bellingham. So let's switch gears and talk about the CJ-10. So everybody out there knows that is on my conquest list for CJs. And the reason is, everybody thinks the CJ-8s are rare, are probably the rarest CJ, along paired with the CJ-6s. Yes, the CJ-6s are very rare. But the CJ-8s people think are the rarest CJ out there. Some say the CJ-4, but the CJ-4 never actually went into production. So we won't consider a production. But when you look at the production numbers for the CJ-10, they were in the low thousands. So when we look at the CJ-10 was an AMC era vehicle, but it was actually manufactured and built purely for export, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So they were all ended up outside of this country. So though they're a CJ model, they're a civilian Jeep model, they were really manufactured purely for export, for commercial purposes and and civilian purposes in the export markets. Tons of them ended up in Australia. But when you look at the CJ-10s themselves, again, production numbers are really tough to get, and especially during the AMC era. But between 81 to 86, there were less than 1,000 CJ-10s produced, which is mind-blowing, absolutely mind-blowing. And all of those left the country.
Yeah.
None of them really stayed here, other than for things that were purpose-built or for maybe in a rare instance, they were commercially used. They were all exported. But those have they use the J10 chassis, that 118-inch chassis, which they basically adapted with some CJ sheet metal, added some square lights. One of the first square light.
Yeah.
Before the YJs, there was a square light Jeep that wasn't an SJ, right?
So weird.
But the CJ-10s were offered with the 2.5 inline 4, the 4.2, my favorite engine, the 258 inline 6, and also the SD33. They were paired up to the T177 for the manual transmission. But again, there was like less than 1,000. By the research I did, there was roughly at most about 900 of those that were actually produced, and they were all exported. So let's talk about the CJ-10A, because that is what you have. And a little background for our listeners is the CJ-10A was a variant that has the shorter wheelbase. What chassis is the CJ-10A on?
It could be custom, but it looks like a standard like Jeep as far as length goes.
I thought it was the 88-inch also. I had a little bit of trouble actually, finding that in some of my pre-show research. But what I did find is that the CJ-10A was produced in Mexico purely for a government contract, and they were mostly all just used as aircraft tugs, right?
Yeah.
which is wild. So, well, I guess. So you have two CJ-10As, and you're in an area where there's a lot of aeronautic research, being in the Pacific Northwest. So maybe that makes sense. Where did you find both the 82 and the 86 CJ-10A?
So the my daily driver, the 86, that one, my dad, there's a huge equipment auction that everyone flocks to. It's been around here forever, and he was a regular there for shop equipment and whatnot. And this Tug CJ-10A is sitting in the lot there, probably like 16 years ago now. It was only going for like maybe $800-900. So he ended up buying it for $1,000, threw a battery in it and drove it to the shop. And kind of started looking it up and doing a bunch of research. And he's like, God, this would make such a great farm truck. Cause my grandpa actually has a cattle ranch in the islands by us, the San Juan Islands. His place is just a graveyard of old Fords. But going back to the Jeep, my dad's thought was this would be such a perfect farm truck for him. So they started building it. I mean, because with such a short wheelbase, there's not a whole lot you can do. And let alone, it's not super well known, but they're only two-wheel drive. They have a transfer case, but there's no front diff. It's just a straight axle up front.
Is that for the 10As and the 10s, or just the 10As?
Just the 10As. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So the transfer case is there to like lock it in low range for pulling aircraft around. And then the rear end is like a Dana 70 or something like that with 488 gears. So my dad put this tech of ours at the time, who was a huge Jeep guy. He went to town, started fabricating it, cut the frame, extended it, set up custom high steer up front with like a Chev 1-ton front end, and set up the flatbed. Just did all the standard like Jeep stuff, but to this Tug, and built a custom push bar for the front. So it's got a gnarly cattle pusher on the front of it.
But he didn't swap out the SD33.
Thank the Lord. So that ended up on my grandpa's cattle ranch almost immediately. And it's kind of sad because that was the first rig I can remember getting to drive around my parents' property. Obviously way before I had my license, but just being able to hop in it and drive it around the yard. And I thought it was so cool because it was so short and had the diesel, which for some reason, like that just really did something for me, like just the diesel noise and clatter. So I was really bummed to see that go to my grandpa's farm. And ever since then, as soon as I got into Craigslist and everything, I was looking every day, like all over the country. And you'd come across them, but you're like, well, I'm 15 years old. I don't think I'm going to be able to feasibly pick up this CJ-10A in Florida. So fast forward to tech school, obviously still looking every day and driving my diesel Dart. I come across one in Bellingham, listed for like $750. I immediately called the folks and they're like, well, we have somebody who is going to look at it this afternoon. And I was like, I can be there right now. I will come with a trailer, cash, ready to go. And I don't know what the deal was. They couldn't get a hold of him fast enough, but they said, okay, come check it out. So I came, I hardly looked at it. I handed him cash and popped the hood. The head was missing. One of the cylinders was
after you bought it, you find this out, which is amazing. I love that.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Like, so I see this piston is like stuck in one of the sleeves. So I was like, this is going to be interesting. But, so yeah, I took it home And I think I was so excited that night, knowing that I had these other engines sitting around. I pulled that motor like the night that I brought it home. And I did it in the driveway at home. Of course, we have a shop in town, but I couldn't wait. Like, I had to do it. So pulled it out right in the yard. And I went to go grab one of the other engines. And just from sitting for so long, it was locked up. So I jumped that idea. And then fast forward probably like 2 years later, guy down in, it was probably like an hour away from me, Everett, he had a turboed SD33T, made it up to a 4-speed out of the Scout, and he had it listed for like $900, and it was in immaculate shape. Like, paint was still all there, everything, which is just unheard of for the ones that really went through the ringer. So drove down, picked that up, swapped it in, and I kind of left off there. I'm super close to having it running. It's just time has been kind of a demon for me. But
and that's on the 80. That's the 82 CJ-10A.
Yeah.
So that's pretty cool. That's how you found it. Like, what's amazing is that like when I'm finding cars, like for my collection, my own personal collection, I'm picking these things up all over the country, and you're finding these like super rare, bottom of the barrel, low production, down the rabbit hole Jeeps just in your backyard everywhere, which is mind blowing to me, right? This is like a dream of mine. And you're finding these things like, in the same town you live in, which is, I guess that's how it happens sometimes, right?
It's insane. I think I may be wrong, but from what I understood is that some of the reservations kind of had first dibs on a lot of like retired government equipment. And that's kind of the understanding I had as to why there's so many around here. Cause we have a decent sized reservation right by us. And, the white one that I have, that's supposedly where that came from. And then I keep finding more and more, locally. The cool thing about the 82 is like 2 years after I bought it, the couple that I purchased it from called me out of nowhere, and they're like, "Hey, we were just cleaning our shop up and we found the whole records list from the Air Force that we got when we purchased it." So I was like, "Oh my gosh." So I show up, I'm reading through it. It has work orders from like every broken part that occurred, like every failure, every like, a caliper bolt worked its way out, and now the Jeep's stuck in the middle of the track. And it was super cool. Like, it was kind of damning to the Jeep because ultimately every work order ultimately said like, this is not okay for use. Like, this needs to go down the road. Which just cracks me up. I don't know how going so slow pulling an aircraft, the thing could break, but evidently they were breaking them like crazy.
So the 82 you don't have running right now?
No, it's super painfully close, but it's just not quite there.
So have you finished the engine swap yet, or?
Yeah, so the engine's in. What I've been doing, since every application uses just a slightly different fuel setup, I've been swapping between my marine application engines that I have, my Scout applications that I have, and I think I have one out of an older Scout too. But regardless, taking all those pieces and making it into one that works well for a CJ-10A, because they have like a dual filter setup. And if you look at one and like a Scout engine versus like my Dart engine, they have like weird differences just with fuel filter location, a hard return line versus a rubber return line, pulley location. So I've been having to kind of rob parts off of these other motors to make a complete, cohesive, running setup. the other interesting thing is like trying to make it. I don't want to just chop a bunch of wires and make it work, which I totally can. But the inner like technician in me is like, okay, I would like to make this like turnkey, nothing weird, like exactly like a CJ-10A should be. So I ended up with a lot of the harness out of the Turbo Scout still attached to that turboed motor. So trying to like mate the CJ-10A wiring to a Scout wire harness has been kind of interesting, but I want everything to work, and I could be super impatient and just get the thing running because you need one wire to fire that thing up. Literally, it's just like a 12 valve. Like you crank it over and it'll run. But I really want it to be ready to roll.
So you're telling me you can't go on Amazon and just pick up a painless wiring harness for a CJ-10A? I mean,
I'm not going to lie. I looked.
That's too funny. But hey, there are a lot more CJ-10As out there than there are CJ-10s. I mean, CJ-10A is like, it's interesting, like depending on what you read, some say, oh, there were 1,000 to 1,500 produced under that government contract. Some say like 2 to 2,500. Some say like 2,300. But in the grand scheme of things, there still weren't. Those are very, very, even if at the high end, 2,500 were produced during that government contract, right? That's still nothing. And they were purpose built vehicles that worked every single day. So their ability to survive over the long term was the odds were not in their favor, which is absolutely. And the fact that you ended up with two of them is even more amazing. It's
well, it's super cool. Like doing all the research that anyone would do, trying to find more, trying to find like documentation, because I'd love to see those like official numbers. But yeah, you're right. They're either like 1,000 to 1,500 or they're like 22 to 2,500. It's really unclear. But along that research, I found like so many forum threads about guys who were in the Air Force at that time and getting to run them. Like you hear horror stories and like, well, they're so short and heavy in the back. I mean, we used to like try and pop wheelies with them. So like you get them like slamming it in reverse and slamming it down into gear, trying to pop a wheelie, and it just cracks me up to hear about it. But
that's funny, man. There's a gentleman in Australia that us at the Classic 4x4 podcast, we do have listeners in the Oceania area and in Australia, and a gentleman reached out because he had heard me talking about my conquest list, and he had said, hey man, we have a bunch of CJ-10s here. And during that AMC era, if you think about some of the coolest vehicles that AMC produced during that AMC Jeep era were all sent out of this country. They were all exported. The CJ-10, was one of them. But the one that we talk about, we haven't talked about a lot, is the CJ-8 Overlander. And where did they all end up? Almost all of them ended up in Australia, of all places. So Australia is this like treasure trove of amazing, rare, unique Jeeps. And this guy is like, he had actually reached out to me because I had mentioned the CJ-10s. He's like, oh, I have a couple CJ-10s. One set up with the factory bed, which is super rare.
Oh yeah.
The other one was set up with just a farm flatbed that had been swapped at some point. And he's like, oh, and I have a couple Overlanders. And I was like, excuse me, what did you just say? He goes, oh yeah. So I'm like writing back to him, and he's like, oh yeah, those are like pretty abundant down here. CJ-8 Overlanders. There's like a whole, which here in the States to see one of those is like
unheard of.
There's a gentleman ironically in New Jersey. I don't know him, but I know that he does collect Jeeps, and I've never met him. And I actually don't even know his name, but we know some common people who does have one, but they're rare, super rare. But Australia has this treasure trove of all these super rare, amazing Jeeps, right?
Yeah. God. Well, it's funny you say that. Like I posted on my Instagram, like, look, saying, well, how cool it'd be to have like a Nissan Patrol, because I've made friends just through social media, like you said, with folks in Australia and all over. And the patrols are plentiful. And the guy who got back to me, he's like, "You're looking for a patrol?" And he sends me pictures of just his yard full of junked patrols. Oh my gosh. What is it going to take to get one of these up here? Like, I just can't believe how many were sitting there.
A lot of them have come. The ones that are here in the States were actually imported from Central and South America, from Latin America. And, I'll never understand the patrols because they're rare, they're unique, they're super cool. But when they hit the market, and you see them hit the market, like there's been a yellow one on the market, fully restored, beautiful, low mileage, that the gentleman can't even get rid of, right? They hit the market and there's really no demand for them, right?
I know.
But at some point, people weren't interested in CJ-8s, right?
True.
And that changed.
Yep.
So
yeah, I am surprised, like personally, I mean, just you type in Nissan Patrol, like that right vintage with the SD33T in it, like they are just monsters off the road. Like they're good work rigs. I just cannot believe there aren't people trying to import that vintage up here. Like locally, I've seen some of the later model ones creeping up that have been imported, but personally, I haven't seen that, like the turbo diesel or even the naturally aspirated ones, SD33s, coming over here. I don't get why, because I think they're awesome, but I don't know why they haven't taken off.
I'm going to say, but I think they are super cool also, but it's purely supply and demand, right? There's people are going to bring them in if they're selling, right? At one point, people started bringing in Defenders and they started to sell, and now people are bringing them in like absolute bonkers, right? But you know what? There's just, every time I see a patrol out on the market, they don't go for big numbers, and they're just like, they sit. And it's sad because they're, like you said, super cool. And it's like another one of those things where I wish I had enough room in my in my warehouse, right? To put them. If I had a limited space, I would have anything and everything. I could get my hands on. Space is my biggest constraint. So that is super cool. I didn't realize the 82 wasn't running, but you're almost there. You're definitely gonna have to post that. The fact that you drove your first car and drove all through high school a diesel SD33 powered 74 Dodge Dart is just way too cool for anyone's own good, right? But
it kept me out of trouble.
No, definitely. Keep you under. Got a lot of torque, right? You're not going that fast, no?
Yeah.
That's funny. But other than that, like, one thing you mentioned to me in the pre-interview, which I thought was really cool, which I don't want to call it a hobby, but it's one of those things that is a lost art that I think we need to talk about, because there aren't a lot of people doing it out there. And you're one of the few, is antique brake lining. Like, talk to me about how you got into that, how you started doing it. And, you're doing antique brake lining from everything from, early trucks and cars to industrial equipment. Like, talk to our listeners about what that process is like, and not only how you got into it, but what that process is like.
Oh, totally. So way back when, that was a pretty standard thing for a shop to do. Reline brakes. As time went on, it became useless because you could buy, more often than not, a replacement brake shoe or whatever, for whatever application. But there's still that need for it. So there was a local place here in town, way back when, that was still doing it. And, my dad hired, the guy that had been doing most of the brake relining as a service advisor. So when that company went out of business, so he brought him on with the idea that they would continue the brake relining. It's kind of like a side venture of the shop. So he bought all the equipment and everything, and kept the guy going on doing brake relining. So then once I was finally old enough to really start working at the shop, that gentleman trained me on doing the brake relining. And once he left the business, I was the brake relining guy. So, and it's been really cool because you get to see some customers you probably wouldn't see otherwise. Myself being really connected to the agricultural industry, it was really cool to get to assist some of these old farmers with their old vintage equipment and tractors. And it's a pretty primitive process, all things considered. I mean, my day-to-day working as a tech, I'm using a scan tool more often than not. And then at the end of the day, I clock off and go out to my little sweatshop and I'm drilling holes in this old crusty lining and popping rivets in. And it is really cool. But and like you said, it's a lost art. Like we have stuff shipped from us to us from Hawaii and Alaska. People are just looking for anything to try and get their piece of equipment back on the road. The process itself is fairly self-explanatory. You're basically just taking an old brake shoe that either the shoe has gotten soaked from a bad wheel cylinder or the material is finally worn down to nothing. And you're removing that, whether it's riveted, you got to pop all the rivets out, or if it's bonded with this glue, old school glue, you kind of have to like chisel it off, and it's strenuous. But once that's done, then you kind of just prep the surface, and if you're bonding it, you'll put glue on it and cut the new material to fit, and then you can bake it. Otherwise, you're riveting, and if that's what it calls for, and you're using old school equipment to rivet all that together. Like when we're buying inventory for rivets, more often than not, we can go on eBay and buy like a pallet of it for $20. And it's pretty cool. Like I said, I've gotten to work with some really cool people because of that. And that's actually how the Dart ended up going to a tractor show like every year. Is we set up a booth at this vintage antique tractor show in our area every year, just marketing to people that are restoring these old tractors and trucks and whatnot. And there'd be cars there every now and then. So I'd bring my Dart out there, and it's crazy to see the crowd that would bring. So it was a double whammy, getting to talk about brake relining with a bunch of old guys and get to chat about the Dart in the process too. So, but yeah, I really enjoy doing the brake relining. The equipment side of it is pretty crazy too. Working on some of these construction rig brake bands is just wild. I mean, you go from like an 8-inch long brake shoe to an 8-foot long brake band that's for this big gravel yarder. I mean, I've got a crane in the back of the shop just to lift it up off the ground high enough to be able to rivet it. And I have to use this big old school air riveter to do it. It's really cool to see. Is really hard on the shoulders and back, just trying to get it lined up perfectly. But it's been a really cool thing to do.
What's amazing though is it's great to hear that things like this and these unique trades and are being passed down from generation to generation. And it's like body work, these days body shops, they take a panel off and they go to the cardboard box that came from the wholesaler and put a new panel on. And 9 times out of 10, that panel is actually already painted, right? So,
Yep.
It's like old school body guys. Like these are dying arts and dying trades that it's so great to hear that it's being passed down from generation to generation. And you as a younger guy, have that expertise and that ability to pass it down to another generation. Because, at this point, I think drum brakes for the most part there is really no application in modern automotive, right?
Yeah.
There's minimal application in equipment, right? Large scale equipment. So, and that's now. That's in 2023. Wait till 2033, 2043. I mean, as technology continues to evolve, there literally will never be anyone out there that would have any experience. And you have that ability to pass it down to more generations and teach more people about it. So that's great to hear, man. So, but
it's the dream.
it definitely is the dream. As we wrap up here, I'm going to ask you, is there anything else like unique that you collect that, all of us car and truck and vehicle collectors, we also have something else that we collect. Is there anything else cool that you collect?
It's kind of funny. Like, I was thinking about that, like, just preemptively. Not necessarily. Like, I've gotten to nerd out on the memorabilia of the SD33 stuff, because if you're gonna do it, go all the way. So, like, I just picked up this old ad marketing Chrysler's equipment engine lineup. And it's like all these like 2-stroke diesels, but then in their lineup is the Nissan diesel, because Chrysler was the one who made the connection with Nissan to bring the SD33s over. And so they were labeled as like a CN633. So I've had a lot of fun, like picking up these ads from all over the place. Along those lines, like I mentioned tractors before, personally, I'd love to pick up one of the tractors that actually has the Nissan diesel in it from way back when. But so I've picked up a lot of memorabilia from those, the international like 274s and 284s. It was a joint venture with Komatsu and International, and Komatsu was using these either was it a Mazda gas engine, and it might have been a Mitsubishi gas engine, I don't remember, or a Nissan diesel, which was this 3-cylinder version of everything I have. So it's been fun to collect that stuff. As far as like interest goes, like I really love the vintage like ag equipment, and like every year we do a huge cider pressing with the family, and we use like this super old, fully restored cider press that my grandpa put together, and it was his family's from way back when. So I definitely have that interest in that level. So once I get into some space, it's going to be full.
That's cool. It's funny. Like, I don't collect really anything else other than cars, like or classic 4x4s at this point. But recently I've had a similar thing where, I always, when I restore any of the trucks in my collection, I always like to make sure that I bring it as classic as possible and and paint them. If I have to paint them in a color that was available in that year. And so as a result, I've ended up acquiring a bunch of factory new old stock paint chip cards.
Oh, no way.
Yeah, for Jeeps. And I've just throughout the years, I've just acquired a ton of them, and I had them stacked in my garage on a shelf. And the other day I was like, these are pretty cool. Like, I never went out to actually collect them. I just acquired them out of a need where I wanted to say, okay, in 1981, what was available for the AMC Jeeps? In 85, what was available? In 65, 73, whatever was available. So I ended up amassing a bunch of these things, and I just started to hang them up in my garage. And it's pretty cool. It's just one of those, like you said, like, these things, you come across these things and you're like, I have it. I didn't realize I was collecting it, but I happen to be collecting it, and they're kind of neat, right? But
that's so awesome.
Since I've been buying these things, and again, you buy them on eBay for like $1.99, $2. They're oddly, they're very abundant out there. but I've had a lot of people ask me, hey, can I borrow your 1983 AMC Jeep car? You know, I'm
No
doing,
way.
yeah, no problem. Yeah. And I have like, at this one, I have from like the mid 60s, starting in 1965, because I had that CJ2A, or I'm sorry, the CJ 5A Tuxedo Park that I did, pretty much all the way through like the 90s at this point, into the YJ colors. But it's just, I started to hang them up and they look kind of cool, right? Why not?
That's awesome. That's
cool.
so awesome.
Well, Dakota, man, I can't thank you enough for joining us today. You not only have the coolest name out there, right? I feel like you should be an actor, right? I feel like when actors change their names, like to be more interesting, like the name that like somebody's agent should choose for them is Dakota Black, right?
Yeah. I mean, in another life, I was a cowboy. Like that's such a cowboy name.
Definitely, man. Either a cowboy or you should be like in the Hollywood Hills living the high life, right?
100%.
So, but hey, man, I really appreciate your time. You joining us on the Classic 4x4 podcast to not only talk about the Nissan SD33 diesel engines, but the CJ-10s. And it amazes me. Everybody I come across that has a CJ-10, they don't have one. They always have more than one. And you're continuing to prove that theory, right? So, but hey, man, I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining us today. And, I hope to cross paths with you soon.
Awesome. Thank you.
That was a fun conversation with Dakota. Who knew dealers installed diesels in Darts and Dusters during the 70s gas crisis? But make sure to follow him on Instagram at the SD33 Garage. Also, check out our next episode with Caleb Jacobs, the truck editor from The Drive. He's written some pieces about corners of the truck world we didn't even know existed.